Hello, I'm Chuck Webster, Wareflow on Twitter. That's WAREFLO. And I am with two physicians and an expert on workflow technology who has taken an interest in healthcare. And this was triggered by an online conversation I had with Kathy Nieder, who is, are you a family medicine physician?
I am. Indeed.
In Kentucky. And the conversation had to do with something roughly called electronic health record workflow coordinator, improvement and coordination. And I said, what a great idea for a blab. And so I kind of pulled you guys together. And so in a moment here, I'm going to introduce, in fact, I'll just do it right now. So Jimmy, who are you?
I'm James Legan. I go by Jimmy IE_Vanagan on Twitter. I've been involved in social media now since about mid-2014. And one of the main reasons I got involved in social media, specifically Twitter, where I blog, and thanks to you, Chuck, I've been periscoping and blabbing of late, is because some of the success that I've been able to find in my small office practice here in Great Falls, Montana. Got 8 docs in our group, and I like to share what I'm doing, some of the secrets that I've learned along the way, just as my way of giving back to the profession. So that's me in a nutshell.
And thank you, Jimmy. And Walter, give us a minute and 30 seconds about Walter and workflow and why you're here interested in healthcare.
Okay. I am a management consultant with a background in electronics engineering. I've been working on workflows in manufacturing. I started off as a process control engineer with General Electric, doing cement plant automation, steel, pulp and paper, things of that nature. And then I joined Bechtel in the mid-'70s, and I worked on Critical Path, which is, for me, a precursor to these kind of BPM workflows. And then we got a grant at one stage in one of our companies to build an expert system for psychiatry. And that was in 1992 or 93. And we introduced, as a result of that, in 1995, a workflow management system that pretty much has stayed the same. It's now at version 8, but it's pretty much all the same about having best practices and being able to implement them, and yet without making it rigid, so that people can follow whatever protocols they want to implement using their forms. And there's no programming to speak of except when you have to build rule sets. Those are a little bit beyond the capability of many people, but not that much more complicated than Excel spreadsheets. So that's it.
Very good introduction. And I wish Sean was here, the social work guy, because he's very interested in workflow and mental health and technology. James, could you possibly tweet him the link to this?
Yeah. You bet.
Get on the stick there. Pull your weight. So now, Kathy, to whatever degree of specificity, why are we here talking about this subject? And introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Kathy Nieder. I'm a family practice physician for more years than I care to admit to, and when the electronic health record came along with our system, I'm an employed physician. With our first EHR, I was a physician champion for that and helped with the implementation. And we were 2 years into that and decided, maybe this isn't the right system for us. So we began with a new implementation. My office and one other office was an early adopter practice in October, and now we have 5 hospitals that will ultimately go live on the system, with a large number of employed physicians as well. And I'm more of a hands-on person, so I've been doing help with go lives, sitting in on Go Lives helping the physicians and other advanced practitioners use the system. And what I can observe is that the IT people are wonderful, but they don't always understand our workflows, and they don't teach our workflows when we go through training sessions. So the docs get in there and they have, you know, a certain amount of knowledge about how to use the system, but they have no idea how to put it all together. And what I have apparently a pretty decent gift for doing is helping them through that process. So it's not in stone and it may not work out, but my system's talking to me about helping them to do that as part-time, being patient care part-time and part-time actually at the elbow support and helping doctors on board, helping with workflows. And so they asked me to write a job description, and I'm like, I've never written a job description. I'm not even sure what I would put in that job description. So that's why I approached Chuck and said, what do you think are the important things that someone in my position as a clinician helping other physicians and advanced nurse practitioners, PAs, to use the most, get the most out of their system, what would you expect me to be able to do? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And as Oculogyric said, this sounds all too familiar. Although, what's interesting is you know, in my preparation for this, okay, first of all, I have a bunch of Twitter alerts set up, Twitter and Google alerts for things to do with workflow and electronic health records and health IT. And in one of so basically a new web page appears someplace, and I, you know, every morning at 4 a.m. I get a list of kind of like new interesting stuff, you know, fresh meat. And about once or twice a week, I see job descriptions, and they are for, you know, basically clinical workflow analysts of various sorts, and sometimes I tweet those out, and I also look at them because, you know, when healthcare organizations are hiring people is kind of a leading indicator for what they're going to be doing in the next year or two. I mean, this is kind of true in general. You know, the folks that run the organization imagine where they want to be in a year or two, and then they have to hire the people to make that possible. And so, hey, there's Steve Waldron, and this is super because I'm really happy that Steve is here. I'm welcoming him, and so I want to do a brief. Techie Doc is a family medicine fellow in Kansas City, and he's very interested in workflow. In fact, to the extent that we've had met in face to face and talked about industrial engineers or management engineers. So I'm getting a sound from somewhere. I'm not sure where. Anybody have any clue where? Is that me or? Nobody else is hearing it.
I hear
I hear it.
It sounds like an airplane. Now
it's strange.
Now
okay. No, Blab is like that. Blab is full of random weird things, and the present company excluded.
Wow, tell me about that.
Yeah, it is. Well, anyway, okay. So what I did was, and I'm not going to dominate. I'm going to just kind of mention this, and I wrote. I didn't have to write much of this. What I did was I just searched for electronic health record workflow job something, I forget what, coordinator, and boom, I found a job site that had almost 500 job listings, open job listings, including many which were being promoted. People were paying ads to be, listed. And then I went and I looked at 10% of them, the first 46, and I searched through each job post, and I looked at the workflow section, and then I copied and pasted that. So I think if you scroll up, you'll see that. And now in a moment here, I'll figure out some kind of question to ask you guys, so I'm not just talking. But what I see when I looked at this list of things, I'm seeing, okay, requirements, knowledge of hospital and surgical processes and workflows, duties, perform in-depth analysis of workflows, update test scripts to reflect proposed workflows, create documentation for future state workflows, and create and maintain workflow diagrams and so forth. Now, I'm not. I was in an earlier. I don't know. One of you guys has got is sitting next to a railroad track, and periodically a train goes by. So, which reminds me of a joke, but I'll only use that later. So as I used to be a medical informatics professor, mm-hmm. and whenever you have a problem out there in society or a problem,
that's me. Sorry.
Okay, we know who it is.
No, that one was me.
Okay, one of the things you do is you start designing curricula. You say, okay, we could teach our students to analyze workflows, and we could teach them to use electronic health records, and we could teach them to be the arm or the elbow of someone who's using these systems. And so, that was kind of my angle to do this. And so at this point, what I'm going to do is kind of pose an overarching kind of goal, and then throw it back at you guys. And that is, I think healthcare and health IT has a tremendous workflow problem. And you can construe that however you like. And now I'm going to throw it back at you guys. How do you think does healthcare have a workflow problem? And if we do, how would you characterize this workflow problem? And what do you think we need to do in order to solve it? And any of you three can jump into it.
Everywhere but my office.
Carl, Walter put up his finger a fraction of a second before you spoke, James.
I don't believe that healthcare has a workflow problem, because the same problem exists in manufacturing, law enforcement, business to business. It's the people in healthcare that have a problem with workflows. That's what the source of the problem is. It tends to be two things. Number one is that the folks that came from business process management seem to have a passion for imposing languages and notations on workflow development. And the effect of that is that ordinary users in the departments are no longer able to build and manage their own workflows outside of rule sets. And so the approach that seems to work is when we do it, we send in a facilitator, and the facilitator basically does absolutely nothing more than say, and then what do you do next? And we don't draw it on butcher block or Post-its on blackboards or whiteboards. We do it in real time on the screen. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is that the facilitator stands there and somebody says, well, we do this. And then we do this, and then we do this. And as the different steps are identified, we have parked in advance at least images of all the forms that they use, maybe 200 of them. And what form do you use as step 3? Well, I use this one. And the result of all of this is that within an hour, you can build a 20 to 30 step workflow. You can compile it, you can deploy it, you can have stakeholders piano playing it, and they get into dreadful arguments. This is not the right form. The logic isn't correct. The routing of this particular task is not correct. And so within an hour, they have 2 or 3 iterations, and they now are a little bit closer to having something that works. And so that seems to work for us.
And Walter, what I want to say here to Kathy and to James and several folks who are listening in, I am very familiar with the model of software development that you were talking about, in which you get the users involved in the direct manipulation and tweaking and systematic improvement of the workflows, not based on arcane notations, but rather based on, well, that didn't work exactly the way I wanted it. Can we make it a little bit different? Okay, well, and pretty soon some of the more precocious ones, they start messing around with the various editors. There is a vast chasm because I've been a proponent of exactly what you're talking about, Walter, for over 2 decades. But what we now have to figure out here, and this is really interesting because we've got two folks, myself and Walter, who are familiar with this sort of different way of creating software. And then we've got Jimmy and Kathy, who are coming out of healthcare, who are using, Jimmy is an unusual creature here. In a moment, I think, Walter, you might have heard me describe him in a moment, but what we do have is something that's somewhat representative, and that is Kathy is from a larger organization that is using a system that went through some kind of a procurement process. I think I heard you say that you started out with one system, spent a couple of years with it, and then changed some directions. Jimmy is from a smaller organization. And is a tinkerer and has cobbled together something that he's happy with, and he doesn't have the same kind of tools, Walter, that you talked about, but he's got the kind of attitude of a user who says, I'm going to own my workflows. I'm going to bend the workflows to my will, and so something that I've been trying to accomplish. Now, actually, for a couple of decades, but kind of on social media for the last 5 years, is to try to bring together these two worlds. And I'm hoping that Techie Doc is still on because we've had these conversations. Techie Doc is a family medicine doc who has actually come to a workflow technology conference a couple of years ago in DC. Kathy, I'm kind of. There are many things to admire about Kathy, but what I like about Kathy is that she's intrigued with an idea and then she jumps in. And so I'm remembering 5 or 6 months ago, somehow Jimmy and I got her to narrate an entire 1-hour tweet chat on Periscope, and she just said, "Okay, I'll do it." So. Now, before we get to Jimmy, I think we got Kathy. Could you go a little bit? How can Walter and Jimmy and Chuck help you do whatever it is you think you might be useful to you in your organization and for healthcare in general?
Well, how do you help? I mean, my job is, like I said, very hands-on. I'm just trying to help these folks who are trying to take care of patients improve their workflow with a system that they can't bend a lot. They can't tweak a lot. We got to work with what we got. How do I help them with that?
I'll jump in there just a little bit. I actually had a debate with the chief medical officer of Cerner about 2 months ago, who is head of a big large, successful organization, and I said, well, the problem is that electronic health record workflow is not very customizable. And he said, electronic health record workflow is incredibly customizable. Well, first of all, EHRs are relatively more customizable than other software in other industries, and because they have to be. But you know what? They're not nearly customizable enough. And to the point, and I think Walter can probably do a better explanation of this than I, and that is that yes, you can rearrange things on the forms, and you can rearrange what happens when you click on a button, but there really isn't anything keeping track of the goals and the tasks and the workflows, and then executing escalation logic and routing logic. That kind of stuff is relatively frozen in most electronic health records. What's happening right now in the sort of health IT industry is people are basically kind of papering over the electronic health records. They're adding another layer. But the question is how do we help Kathy? And so Jimmy, I think, is a really interesting model here because Jimmy has not had the benefit of the kind of sophisticated workflow technology that you're talking about, and yet he has created a kind of a system that he's very happy with, and he has a nurse who's kind of like who's his intelligent workflow engine who makes things happen. So Jimmy, could you kind of try to pull together a little bit of what I'm spewing out into some kind of coherent narrative and solve our problems for us?
Well, so Walter and Kathy, just to kind of give you an understanding of my situation, I'm in a small office. We've got a total of 8 docs. And in my pod where I work, I've got a nurse's station, and I've got her outfitted with a dual monitored standing desk. And I've got 2 exam rooms, and then I've got my desk or my office where I have a dual monitor desktop as well. And what I've found some of this over time in terms of implementing my electronic record from the paper world back in the end of 2011. And as Chuck has said, the particular electronic record that I've utilized was designed by a doctor. And in retrospect, I've learned this, but his workflow and my workflow are pretty much identical. So that from the start has been extremely helpful, is that I was able to find a workflow, electronic record that really matched a primary care workflow. Simple. It's not a really large, or it's not designed for a large group practice. So what I say from here on out, you have to realize that. But it really matches my day in and day out workflow, which has been just wonderful. So after implementing that, I then started doing things in phases. First thing was e-prescribing. The next was HL7 imported lab data. The next, and probably one of the best things, was implementing what's called a health CRM. And it's probably one of the single best things I've done in terms of what I think is improving my nurse's efficiency. So at her fingertips, what the health CRM allows her to do is that it allows all my e-faxing in and out of the office. So it is my interoperability channel, if you will, because I have most of the information I need are in PDF forms. So I can get any report, X-ray report, a report from an outside office, from an outside hospital, into our system, usually before I see the patient. But if need be, I can do it instantaneously. And to Kathy, to answer your question, I think, at least in my situation, by implementing the electronic record health CRM and having a simple setup, I never realized how important the physical space is. So I can not only communicate with my nurse electronically, and I don't necessarily have to talk to her, but I've got the option. I can just say, hey, you, or she can say, hey, me, so we're in close contact. So we can communicate that way as an extra layer. So the close proximity, and then her being involved in so many of the pieces of the day-to-day operations, everything coalesces to her fingertips. So she's got the schedule, the electronic record, the health CRM, the portal, everything right through there. So I don't have very many moving parts. I've only got 2 computers that I have to keep updated for my for what I do in my little pod. That's her computer, my computer. And then, Kathy, I think we need to do on a much larger scale is try to find hardware that we use at the point of care, so we don't have to keep a desktop in every exam room. And I only have 2 desktops I have to maintain. So by having what I've used is a Chromebook, and then I use that at the point of care, it's my simulated desktop. So I think if a system can emulate what I'm doing and the points I'm trying to make, and I'm probably not doing very well, is keep it simple, keep as little hardware, effective, just what you can do to do the job day in and day out, have one or very few people manage what you do day in, day out, and have most of the applications coalesce at their fingertips. But I think the litmus test of making sure that your interoperability is complete and that you're doing everything you should is, I think, and I found this kind of to be very true over the last 2 years since I've been using this approach, is what I call projected EHR. And that is, if I've got any holes in any of the information or data, since I share the electronic record and I've turned it into an interactive visual tool at the point of care, I do very little data entry at the point of care. That's the other thing. What I want to try to do is achieve what I think is the fundamental principle of a doctor-patient relationship. Sit down, look the patient in the eye, talk to them, listen to them, and then use the technology to your advantage. And that is, go to it when you can. And what I've chosen to use is a wall-mounted screen, and then I can go over past medical history, meds, allergies, everything there. And when you do a combination of visual and verbal, it really, I think, maximizes the ability to convey what you're trying to do. But that's the litmus test. Is if you've got big holes of data information right there at the point of care, then you're not, something's not right. So you need in my opinion, in a small office, a health CRM, so you can get the data in there, the information in there instantaneously. If need be, get it there beforehand if you can. And then also have a way to interact with the patient through that health CRM as a portal. So I can connect with the patient outside the office as well as inside the office with that health CRM.
So Jimmy, you really, really need to work on your elevator pitch.
Sorry, long one.
Unless you're in the Empire State Building. No, I'm just kidding. I see Sean. Techie guy. I hope you should come. Techie guy can't come on because he's watching Star Wars with his nephew. But there's some elements here. I hope we can get together again because he's influential with the American the AAFP. But what I do want to do is Sean just joined us because Jimmy tweeted him, and Walter described his mental health application. So I'm going to step aside for a moment, and hopefully we can get Sean on there. However, I do think, after Sean, get another minute or two from Walter on his mental health application. Sean will be interested in it. Sean can introduce himself. And then I do think, Jimmy, I'm going to leave you to kind of redirect our gaze back toward Kathy to try to figure, and maybe ask her again, maybe, how has our thinking evolved in the last 30 seconds kind of way here, movement toward progress. So I'm going to step aside, Sean, and I hope you'll step in and introduce yourself. And I hope, Walter, as soon as Sean appears, you'll re-describe your mental health application because he's very interested in that. And then Jimmy can then kind of move us back into this. I guess what I'll do is, Jimmy, when that happens, could you re-ask the question, what is an EHR workflow improvement coordinator? Because I think that was the question that Kathy originally asked. Oh, and here's EHR science. Super. This guy he's even more into workflow notation than I am. And so so at some point, we hope to get Jerome on screen too. So bye-bye.
Okay. Jimmy, just before I re-describe, while we're waiting here, you mentioned something about a wall-mounted monitor, okay?
Yeah.
And I remember in 1988, around then, no, it was 1998, sorry. I went to the State Mental Hospital in Virginia as part of a visit, and they had a scribe sitting in a next room, and they had a couple of monitors behind the patient, and they would have a panel of team reviewers, and the patient would come in, and all of these questions and answers that we're doing right now, they were doing that on the monitor, and there was a scribe who was running the whole thing. In other words, they would put up the electronic health record, and people would look at it and say, oh, it's been 2 weeks since your last appointment, and how about we talk about this today? And then whatever the patient said and whatever the care team said would be on there. And the scribe took care of all of this, and they, of course, kept a permanent record of it, which went back into the EHR. So the essence for me of an EHR is that, number one, it's a repository so that you can give it out to a patient if they ask for it. The law says you have to do that, of course. But the more important thing is that before any session with a patient, you get a chance to look at what used to be a paper chart where you can review in reverse chronological order all of the interventions and hopefully make a plan for what are we going to do today and what things have worked and what things have not worked. This is for mental health, of course. And so the EHR is the core of any of these systems, and then the workflows are on top of that, because it's a bad mistake to make the workflow totally rigid. So what we do is run this thing in a case management environment where it's just like case management in the old sense of the word. And you have structured, logically connected steps that come into it. But at any time, the caregivers can deviate from the rigidity of the logic flow and do whatever they like. And that includes revisiting steps already completed, skipping over a step, recording data at a step that's not yet current, and inventing a new step that wasn't there at all. So it's designed to be flexible, unlike a manufacturing process where you go through the same thing 1,000 times every day. So that's basically what we did. And the only other comment I'll make before I get off here and start listening instead of talking is that the workflow construction has been very difficult in the past, but today it's either continuing to be very difficult for those that insist on languages and notations, which deprives the ordinary user from building their own workflow. But at the other end of the scale, if you have a piece of paper and a pencil and you can draw circles and connect them with arcs, then the computer will take the electronic version of that, compile it, roll it out, let people piano play it, and then you can follow precisely what they're doing and say, no, 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 the logic here is not correct. You missed a step. This step is unnecessary. The form you're using at this step is not appropriate. We need another form. The form is okay, but there's missing data. This one has too much data, so they can get a very lively discussion. And before 15 or 20 minutes, you're back to editing your workflow, improving it, rolling out it again. And this type of immediate gratification seemingly is what people want and need these days, as opposed to writing notes, going away for 2 weeks, and then coming back and people say, well, what were we doing? They don't remember.
Yes.
So that's all that I have to say, and then I can comment here in the chat thing, but thank you for having me at your session.
You bet. And Walter, what you're saying about the immediacy is what my nurse and I do even to this day. We've been doing this for several years, and that immediate gratification, you know, if I'm doing something that needs to be done a little more efficiently on her end, she lets me know about it.
Yes.
In a verbal way, and we get it corrected right then and there, and we can see immediately whether it's working or not, and vice versa. So I agree. The physical space of having the folks that are primarily working on the electronic record at the interface, and for my office, it's the nurse and me, the physical space where we can communicate and get things, what I think in peak efficiency and quality is to have all that information right then and there to make the most out of our time.
Sure.
And like you said, we're able to review. And I can start off if I wanted to start off with the medications first, if I wanted to review the vitals, I can. And we have that flexibility as you described. So I think, Kathy, hopefully that can, hopefully that makes sense to what you're thinking about doing with your larger system. You know, I realize mine's a much smaller system, but yours is on a larger grand scale. So hopefully that has some, shed some light on what you're trying to achieve with your deal. But Sean, I wanted to introduce you to Walter here really quickly. Walter has been involved in the mental health software industry to a degree, and he was talking a little bit about that before you joined. So that's why we put a frantic tweet out to you. So thank you for joining. So Sean, tell us a little bit about yourself. But he's from upstate New York, and he's very involved in mental health. He's a social worker and very involved in Twitter and blogs and tweets and
yeah. So
labs.
So my day job is what Walter just said is case management in a classic sense. I'm a mental health case manager for a local county program for youth. I work with kids who are at high risk for either coming out of the hospital or or at high risk for readmission for inpatient psych. So I work with them in the home, in the community. They already have an outpatient therapist, and I kind of am an add-on case management service to try to tighten everything up. And then by night, I do this stuff, involved in social media, blogging, tweet chats. Kathy, nice to meet you. So yeah, and actually, you just interrupted me, very, very politely though. If I didn't check my Twitter feed, I'd still be working on a blog post right now, which you can look for tomorrow. Called it's in response to a document called Crisis Now about it was published by the Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, and they created this document for changing crisis services, mental health crisis services. So it's really interesting, and technology is one of the pieces to the puzzle that they recommend. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think now we're going to just kind of circle back to Kathy, and the initial intent of the blab was to talk about workflow improvement coordination, and she's in the process of helping out her where she's working at currently in Louisville. And Kathy, any thoughts so far?
Can I, before Kathy starts, we've got about 25 minutes. So we start about 5 after, so I think we have enough time. I just want to make sure that Kathy actually leaves with some advice, even if it's not that great. We addressed the reason that we're here. Of course, as I think Jimmy was really teeing that up anyway, because he said circle back and let's, Kathy. I mean, I worked in a hospital MIS department, and this was before we had electronic health records, but we had a variety of other clinical systems. We had radiology information systems and laboratory information systems, and admissions, discharge, and transfer systems, and so forth. And we tried to get them to talk with each other and so forth. What Walter described is a vision for the future. Now, the great thing about there's a line by a guy named Gibson who he was famous for writing science fiction about virtual reality, and he says the future is here. It's just unevenly distributed. Okay, so the kind of stuff that Walter is talking about is here, but it's not evenly distributed, and we have some large enterprise electronic health record systems that aren't whose workflows cannot be tweaked by the users. So you'd have to go back to the programmers, or you have to adapt to the workflows and so forth.
And that's what I'm working with. And
that is what you're working with. So this is a little bit like the the line from years ago, Rumsfeld, where you go to the war with the army you got. And so so the question is, what can we do with the army we got? And I suspect that what I'm going to say is probably already kind of percolating through Kathy's mind, and that is, I've worked in MIS departments closely with clinicians using systems that are not as workflow sophisticated or workflow aware as what Walter described. But there are many things you can do to these systems to improve workflows, and that is you can change the layout. You can change what's on a screen. You can change the order and the layout of what's on the screen. You can change when you click on a button on the screen, what happens next. And all of those influence workflow. In fact, when I talk about workflow, I talk about, my mother was an English teacher, so she drilled into me the difference between affect and effect. So to affect something is to influence it in some way, positive or ill. And to effect is to drive it, is to cause it, is to make it happen, to reproduce it. And the great thing about workflow technology is you can basically effect workflows. But most of the systems in hospitals are to affect the workflow. And that is, if we move the button, it influences the workflow in some way. And so when I worked kind of as a quasi-clinical analyst, and in fact, when I look at the 50 or so job descriptions that I pulled out of the 500 that I searched for, is you need to buddy up with the health IT people. The people who, are willing to allow their eyes to glaze over. In fact, they like their eyes to glaze over when they, are reading the 400-page manual from Epic. In fact, if you look up workflow in the Epic user manual, it's 400 pages on click here, then click here, then click here, then click here to accomplish X. Okay, and so if you want to minimize clicks, which is kind of the holy grail, what you need is someone who knows what to click on behind the scenes to eliminate the click, not behind the scenes. So as you think about like dramaturgy, a stage, you have a stage, and there's a play going on, and there's things happening, and you're enjoying the play, and it's all so fluid and fun. And behind the scenes, you have like ropes and ballast and people changing costumes in 30 seconds and so forth. And all of that's happening behind the scenes in order to make what happens on the stage seem so seamless. And so the current, what Walter described, and I'm a big fan of what Walter, the kind of software, and it does exist. It's coming into healthcare. It's just that, some of the behemoths have such enormous footprints with their legacy software. You kind of have to figure out how to, to survive, how to prosper or go to war with, the army you've got.
The army that you have, right?
Right. Yeah, and my, and I've never used Epic. I mean, I've talked to people. I think I've interacted with a lot of systems that are probably similar to Epic, and that is, while there is this element of you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and I'm a big fan of perfect workflow technology. The users create all their workflows all the time. They don't need the programmers. Well, guess what? You can't let that be the enemy of the good. Okay, and that is in the meantime. And if I think Techie Doc was still on, he would agree with me. You can through for example, now even though Jimmy has worked is in a smaller organization, he's not used as sophisticated a workflow technology as what Walter described. Although the CRM, the customer relationship management stuff that he's using, and the fact that the electronic health record was designed by a physician whose workflows are very similar to his, was a great springboard to where he's gotten to. And that is, I have to say, now, depending on where you are in the organization, we're talking basically, free pizzas for the health IT analysts once a week. You know what I mean? Does that make any sense at all?
I regularly give our IT people cookies, and no, actually, if they actually watch this,
cookies are this.
They call me out for that.
I think it's a ratio.
Okay, let's get Kathy now.
Yeah,
we've got. I have to say that the IT folks that I work with are terrific. They are constantly wanting to make the program work better for the physicians. Their problem is that they're not clinical, and so it's trying to connect the clinical to the IT folks and figuring out how do I see my role as helping them to do that.
So do you need to learn more IT, or do you need to learn more clinical, or both?
I hear you.
Okay, do you need to learn more? Is that coming from Jimmy? I'm going to mute you.
Answer the phone.
No, I think primarily it's being able to communicate well enough, which I can do. I'm pretty good at that. This is the problem that the clinicians having. How can we make this faster or work better, flow better, whatever?
I mean, I think what I've tried to do is try to make the case. I think that there's a third leg to that stool that's important, and in terms of change management, you have the IT, the case managers, but also administration. I don't know what kind of structure you're dealing with in terms of who ultimately kind of makes the decisions, and I think a lot of it has to do with bottom line and how much your company and administration is willing to invest in technology so that it can improve the flow of things and can improve care. And I think it has to, I think that there's a part of it that also needs to match the purse strings too, and to say, hey, this could actually save us money. We're trying to, within our case management organization, trying to get texting going. Youth like to text, apparently.
I'm going to step out for a moment, or maybe even till the end. If you don't see me, that's fine. You guys keep on talking. But what I want to do is get Walter back in, because he mentioned the importance of distinguishing between customization and configuration. Are you leaving Jimmy too?
No, why don't I jump out, since you've already jumped out? And Walter can take my spot, and I'll just be in the peanut gallery.
Okay, I do think from Kathy's point of view, and I think Sean would be interested too, the difference between customization and configuration, as I understand it, and I'm kind of surprised to hear someone else talk about it, I think might be of interest.
I agree.
Yeah, but just I'm gonna finish my thought though, and I'm gonna get going though too. But I think what I was saying was that I think it has to match the bottom line. So we were working on texting, and the National Council on Behavioral Health did a webinar on texting and kind of talked about how it could save money, and I just kind of slid that to the IT person, so along with, darn, I should have slid it with cookies. But I think that there's that bottom line piece too, and that I think that sadly, I think that's where a lot of these conversations come to is the money.
Well, it's money plus meaningful use plus long-term outcomes data collection that takes away from the efficiency and effectiveness of the clinical side. And you can't blame the organization for not going after the MU funding. And there's not much you can do about the government that says that you must now try to collect data so that your children's grandchildren's will not be a burden on Medicaid or Medicare.
Walter, what's the difference between customization and configuration?
Okay. The EPIC system is huge, okay? And our system is probably no smaller. It's got 1.5 million lines of code. So the end game is that it's very difficult to implement changes to it because there's a lot of overhead. We have things in there that we've regretted putting in for 20 years, and we just can't get rid of them. But if you're fortunate enough to have an architecture where it is possible, for instance, to design your own form by dropping objects on a screen and making them into entry fields versus checkboxes versus memo fields and things of that nature. Now you're talking about configuration as opposed to writing a program to build the form. And a key example of that is most form building requires that in the underlying database that you have new tables and new fields to accommodate the data. It's got to be stored somewhere. In the systems that we are familiar with, it's all done automatically. In other words, you don't know anything about tables or fields. The system in the background does all of that, and that makes it configurable because you can have 50 pieces of data on a form, or you can have 3. Doesn't make any difference. So being able to build a workflow and have a compiler that carves it up into bits and pieces and presents them to the right users at the right time that's configuration. Oh, that's a nice kitty cat.
Hello. Yeah, let me try to bridge. I mean, I was the chief medical officer for an electronic health record that was based on a workflow management system. It had a workflow engine, had process. Yeah. You could draw the workflows and so forth. It really was. In fact, it won the first 3 HIMSS Davies Awards, 2003, 4, and 5. But the to me, the difference between customization and configuration, which I think is relevant to Kathy's situation, is, and this is just our own, internal in our organization, how we thought of it. So it may align or not with yours, but we had trained. You had it was like layers of an onion. So at the very, very middle, at the very center, you had the CTO, who was this brilliant rocket scientist who designed the architecture. And then the next level out, you had various programmers. And I was one of the programmers, but I also did some, marketing stuff because I was willing to, get out there and be pompous. And then the next layer out, you had the configuration people. The next layer out, you had the customization people and the trainers. And then, of course, you might go off into like marketing and so forth. And basically, the way we made our distinction was that the customizing involved going to some kind of graphical editor and customizing. It was like, so here's the form that you're wanting to use, and you want to change it. Well, then you flip over to the editor, and in the editor, you can say, okay, I want these buttons in a different order, or put them in a different place. You're designing the workflow, you're designing the form, which can certainly influence the workflow or the screen, and you're influencing the screen flow. But in our case, the configuration specialists were people who were more technical, but also more removed, but they weren't programmers. Okay, and so they were less expensive. So the most expensive thing you can do is to get someone involved who actually has to write Java or mumps or some sharp code, because you change something and then there's all kinds of bugs that might happen, deploy it and so forth. And so when the users would interact with us, they would gradually understand that there were these two layers. And so so first of all, in the user realm, there would be the super users. Super users are always pushing for more access. They say, okay, I want to change this. Can't you just teach me how to change it so I'll change it myself? Mm-hmm. Okay, and you'd have to give them permissions or whatever to do that. Then someone had to teach them, or if they couldn't figure out themselves, then they would do it. And the expense would gradually go up. So if you let the users do it self-serve, then that's the least expensive. So you amortize the effort to create the tools necessary to allow the users to do that. Then you've got the folks who aren't programmers and they aren't database people, because a lot of in what you just described is a lot of the layout of the screen and the behavior of the workflow is basically due to values and tables. Okay? And so people who aren't programmers, who can wander around the database and understand the relationship between the database and the behavior. And I'm not talking about just the data about the patient. I'm talking about the behavior of the application. Yeah. When you click on a button, what happens next? And so
if you have to make a new executable with a programmer, that's customization. If you don't have to do it, it doesn't matter who does it. That's called configuration.
But Walter, you're absolutely right. We need to describe this in terms of, here is a clinician who has taken an interest. So when you talk about executables, I mean, it's like, but there are layers, okay?
Yeah.
So there's a person who can sit at your elbow and tell you what to click on in order to change the screens and change the order and the behavior of the screen. And then there's a person behind them who can do the more difficult stuff, but who aren't necessarily programmers either. You see what I'm saying?
Well, that's true. There's a fine line, and
right. So
it is like an onion, and I very much like the way you've described it, and it's absolutely so. The mix of the number of people who can do the middle part can change and be more technical or less technical.
So what I'm saying strategically is I worked in the EHR vendor looking out at the users, but I would see how the users successfully figured out how to navigate up. These users would figure out basically, okay, the problem that I'm working on is going to require, like this amount of technical expertise of this kind. And the only way that just comes from interaction with the vendor organization. Okay. And so, but I like the whole customization versus configuration, because the customization folks are the folks who sit at your elbow and they can click on things in order to customize the screens and the workflow. And the configuration people are people who can do the more difficult stuff, but who aren't programmers themselves.
Yes.
And then you have programmers. And so you can't, and what I'm kind of basically talking about is gaming the system. I mean that in the best possible manner. That you want to be able to leverage. Say, okay,
right.
What is it? There are people behind the people in this organization, and how do you get to the person you need to get to in order to do what you need to do? Now that's going to come from as you assume your role, which I'm delighted. I mean, I love the idea of the clinician a halftime, and then interacting with the folks to make other clinicians' lives better. And it's going to be a combination of that socialization, the pizzas, getting together and bonding, and then it's also going to be also a function of understanding, in a sense, and this is where I think I'm using Walter to kind of jump in there. And that is the architecture. There's a relationship between the structure of an organization, of a vendor, and the architecture of their product, and being able to navigate that is really important for precocious users to bend the software to their will, which kind of brings me back to, I think, a phrase that I've used with James over the years, in which about months, that he sort of bent the software through a kind of a smaller scale version of what I'm talking about.
Good. Dennis wants to know whether this is people intensive and expensive.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, but don't you think that if you have, if you're not having to use if you're using the individuals who are already using the program, it seems like that gives you more leverage into how you fix the program to make it work better.
Absolutely. Sure. It's just that you're bumping up against the design of the program was laid down 10, 15, 20 years ago. And when I said that you need to go to war with the army you got, not the army you wish you had, I'd love to. The system that Walter is talking about, I'm familiar with that technology. It's much more plastic and malleable, and much more users can basically say, I don't like that, I'm going to change that right now, and you don't have to go back to the programmers in terms of all those layers. But I thought we just needed to get a little more practical and expedient, at least for a moment.
We'll have to talk about interoperability sometime.
Interoperability.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's really a big problem right now, and it wasn't addressed in meaningful use. And it's important because, as Jimmy discovered, he can get his lab tests in there, and he can get all kinds of... we did a system in California for an MCO where they had 112 practices feeding in every day all of their encounter information. So if you wanted to see a patient who had been to 3 or 4 other places, you could, by pressing a button, get all of the encounters that you didn't perform yourself. And that's kind of useful because you don't repeat the lab tests over and over again and things of that nature. So, but it generated 214 million transactions in 8 months. So there's a lot of data flows, and you can't do that on the back of an envelope, obviously. But it's interesting, and it's coming. I think the interconnectivity of EHRs for decision support, not for long-term outcomes data collection, but for real-time decision today. I need to know, if I was a doctor, what happened to this patient yesterday, the day, because they might not tell you.
Well, I'd like to just follow up on that, Walter, and to answer Dennis's question over here. Does your EHR communicate with local hospitals? And it does, in terms of what I describe as not interoperability in the sense that it's being bantered about now. What I think of as interoperability is how you're describing it, Walter, and that's I described as functional interoperability. And I don't want to say too much, but I had a recent situation where I needed to communicate with an outside hospital outside the area, our local hospital. I needed to get some reports done on some imaging study, CAT scans, MRIs. I was able to get that within a very short amount of time, have half dozen family members in the exam room with the patient, with the problem, and we were able to go over everything instantaneously right there. And one of the family members said, "You don't know how helpful this has been to actually see these images on the big screen and also see the document and the radiologist report, understand it." Yes, sorry.
Just a moment. I'm respectful of people's time. We are now at
Oh, yes, sorry. I get carried away.
And I think Kathy might have to leave here in a moment. Do you have another minute?
Yeah,
Okay.
I've just got to answer a
Okay, I want
patient call.
everybody to say whatever they want to say for 60 seconds. So, and then I'm going to end the recording. Kathy can head off, and and then we can continue to blab, and the recording is off. So, Kathy, 60 seconds of your thoughts.
My 60 seconds worth of thought is I think that the configuration and customization is a big deal, and that I think that's something that I really can kind of take back and use as I move forward.
Good.
That was even less
Thank
than
you
60
for stimulating
seconds.
this conversation and for attending. And I look forward to
Thanks, I enjoyed it.
another blab.
Thank you, Kathy. Great seeing you,
All right.
and wish you well.
All right.
And
Nice to meet you,
Walter, 60 seconds of your thoughts.
I sort of ran out of things to say. I'm just going to listen.
Okay, that's it. Jimmy.
I want to, Walter, I tell you, great to meet you, and I find what you're saying extremely fascinating. I don't know all the lingo. I don't have, I got my undergraduate degree in animal vet science, and I thought I was going to be a veterinarian and changed halfway through. I don't have a computer degree. I was actually afraid of computers until just a few years ago, but I've just had to deal with them. I decided not to do any of the meaningful use stuff. I don't have to deal with a boss. I don't have to deal with anything. If I want to make a decision, I can do it myself, and then I have to deal with the repercussions. So I've been able to play and cobble things together, as Chuck says. But what you're saying, there's a huge amount of truth, and it resonates with what you're saying resonates with my experience, which is much on a much smaller, simpler, cruder scale than what you're doing and have done. So, but I do think there is a definite resonation of tone what you're saying, and I really appreciate your time and thoughts here.
Thank you. Thank you.
You bet.
And there's not much difference between a big system and a system for 8 or 10 doctors. It's just a question of scalability. You still have to do all the right things.
And so now I have my 60 seconds, and then I'm going to stop the recording, and then we can hang around longer, or anybody wants to jump in, whatever. And that is, I've been trying to build a wormhole between two industries. One is the health IT industry, and the other is the workflow technology industry. And these labs have, I think, started to create a tribe of complementary folks that come from Memphis. And I think we saw a microcosm of this evening. And I'm so delighted, and I look forward to many more conversations with all of you, and for us reporting to each other a variety of successful initiatives to enlarge, to go from our vision that we're describing here to actual impact. Thank you very much.
And can I say one more thing?
Please.
It'll be quick. And for me, you just got to have fun. You got to have fun what you're doing. You got to love what you're doing, and things will come together. Okay.
All right.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everybody.